Derek Black is an expert, and I don't use that word lightly when it comes to education law, and a director of the University of Southern California's Constitutional Law Center. We have the fortunate opportunity to have him with us this morning to talk about all things legal, and particularly and specifically when it comes to education and education law. Good morning, Derek, and welcome to Choose Views.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You have been ringing the bell for a while now about the dangers of tearing down our public education in America. And obviously, there are certain communities that are going to be impacted by that more than others. But in general, it's a bad beat for us to take that position without a fight. And you know, you've had some recent articles, you've made some recent interviews, but tell us a little bit first about the work that you do at the University of Southern California. I'm sorry, I know that happens all the time. The University of South Carolina, the other USC. I know that probably happens all the time, but tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing when it comes to education law at the University of South Carolina.
Yeah, well, no worries. It happens. Even the university president did it once, although he didn't keep his job for too long after he did it.
Are you serious?
Well, he'd had a little bit. I shouldn't be saying. Anyway, all right. Let me get back. So, anyway, yeah. So, I've been involved in school funding litigation, school segregation litigation, all this stuff. But, right now I'm an expert in an Ohio voucher case, a desegregation case in Minnesota, another case in Tennessee. So, there's just so much going on right now in terms of trying to secure education equality, trying to push back on those that are privatizing education. It's keeping we're stretched thin. I guess that's the best way to put it. Yeah.
So right now, I mean, you talked about this back to the states, Trump's plan to go against, the country's long history of federal support for schools. Shed a little bit of light on that and what you're seeing as hugely problematic there.
Well, I mean, there's so many ways to come at this. I mean, the first one is this sort of idea that this is a modern invention, that the federal government doesn't have an important role. And, as I've been writing and researching, I mean, the federal role in education goes back to before we have a United States Constitution. One of our four major founding documents, Northwest Ordinances, they determined that all the remainder of the land in the United States would be carved up into little squares. Each town would have 32 lots, and the center lot would be reserved, the 16th lot for public schools. 9 of the outer lying lots reserved to generate resources, right? So this is 250 years old. And then the first Department of Education itself comes into, I would say, our second birth of freedom in the United States. After the Civil War, Congress establishes the Department of Education to help ensure education in the South, which didn't have it before, and to also help bring millions of enslaved people into democracy, but also to, get things moving in the right direction elsewhere. And so I think the first point to understand is the federal government has actually been a driver of education opportunity and equality across history. It's not some, random late 1970s thought about, helping the teachers unions get what they want. And that's narrative number one. Number two, and I'll stop, and it goes what you said earlier about Iowa. I mean, this money is spread across needy children across the nation. Children of low income, children with disabilities. Those are sort of the two big pieces. And then we have prohibitions on, sex discrimination. I don't think those are things that Americans want to give up. Lots of families of all economic statuses have students with disability. And when we talk about poverty, to be quite honest, the states that are most reliant on our Title I dollars are not, our blue states, so to speak. There are red states. Massachusetts could walk away from federal dollars tomorrow if it wants to. Alabama and Mississippi cannot.
That is a quote that I am not going to mess up by over-talking it. Can you repeat that, please, sir?
Massachusetts could walk away from federal school dollars tomorrow. Alabama and Mississippi cannot.
Tell us why.
Well, the way schools are funded are based upon local property taxes. And so the more money you have, the more wealth you have, the more you can generate. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, this is kind of shocking to people as well. If you look at what percentage of money that Mississippi spends on public education, it's actually a higher percentage than Massachusetts, because Massachusetts has got resources. They don't have to stretch to fund their education system. But a lot of our red states do, and so they're heavily dependent on federal dollars to make ends meet, right? And I think regular people know what I mean by that. Well, that's the situation in places like Mississippi, Oklahoma, Alabama, Louisiana. But, in a lot of our northern states, that's not the case.
So they're generating revenue, the other states, we'll just say it this way, blue versus red, to make the conversation point. Those states are generating a higher amount of revenue proportionate to the citizens. And as a result, the educational dollars that would come from the federal government don't have to be as flush because there are other sources that, to your point, don't stretch an already deprived, if you will, economic state. Fair statement?
That's right. Yeah, and I want to, be clear and fair. I mean, at the same time, we have states like Wyoming, rural, state, very low wealth. I mean, they've got a lot of resources per pupil there, and they spend them. So it's not just a blue-red state. At the same time, California, I don't understand all the financial dynamics in California, but, it's a wealthy state, but it actually spends a pretty small amount on public education. So, but, California is in a position to make up the difference. I don't know whether politically they would do that, but they are in a fiscal position to make up the difference if they had to.
Right, and I think that's the key, if they had to, but because they don't, they have a strong public education system. I mean, Ronald Reagan is known for tearing down the collegiate the collegiate educational system and the funding that was there, and tried to make that part of our national. I mean, I think that, and you know better than many, a lot of the federal attack started with Reagan, or certainly can be wound back to when Reagan came into office, what he wanted to do to affect public education on a national level, and it hasn't stopped. I mean, when the Republicans get into office, they certainly have pushed hard to reduce the amount of federal funding that goes out to public education. I'm
sorry.
Go ahead, Derek. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, there's a dirty history here as well that it's not as obvious to a lot of folks. But, and of course, the Democratic Party had a long, history of racism, but, it changed and became more inclusive of black folks and other people of color. But the short story is, Richard Nixon, when he lost his first presidential election, he determined he was never going to lose again. I won't use the pejoratives, but, he used some pejoratives. He wasn't going to get, out Dixied again, maybe a nicer way of putting it. And so he after the Democrats had swept the South during JFK's term, he comes back and runs on ending school desegregation, right? And so that ends up being, and he starts his campaign, I think it was in Mississippi, that ends up, and gets the endorsement of Strom Thurmond. That ends up being his pathway to the White House. Now, by the time Reagan rolls around, there's a different level of what's tolerated in public conversation, but Reagan was tapping those same sentiments when he ran for president. He said, let's block grant all the money and send it back to the states. He was tapping into that vibe that Nixon had been explicit about, which is, let's let these Southern segregationists do whatever the heck they want to, right? And so when Trump says, let's let the states decide education, let me be crystal clear on curriculum, on teacher quality, on all these issues. States decide all of that right now. The federal government is prohibited by law from messing with curriculum. So when you say return it to the states, what you really mean is returning anti-discrimination decisions to the state, because all that other stuff is already there.
And by virtue of that, and thank you for clarifying that, this is a conversation that we will dig in deeper and have you back on in the future, because so many people miss that piece right there. Those last 10 sentences are gold, because that's what a lot of people don't understand in terms of the integration between states' management of education versus federal. And is it by law, and this is a question that just popped into my head when you were talking about this, Derek, by by the sheer fact that the Trump administration is trying to change the federal funding mechanism by getting rid of the Department of Education, isn't that in and of itself not constitutional because of the federal law is not allowing for the government to do just that thing? I mean, I'm trying not to put the cart before the horse, but help us kind of ferret that out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, with all of these issues, when we're talking about the federal budget, when we're talking about these departments, like the budget and the departments and their responsibilities are created by law, signed by a majority of the House and the Senate, and then signed by the president. Their law, firm law, decades old. And the president's job, although most people don't, fully appreciate it, is to execute the laws as written. And so eliminating something that you're charged with running can in no way be characterized as executing the law. The president does not have the authority to take down departments that all three branches of government have sanctioned and established, right? But that is what, that's what he's trying to do. And to be fair, I think, some of the more recent executive orders implicitly acknowledge that there are limits to the president's power. So instead of destroying departments, they're trying to scare people into going home, right? Because they know they can't just take it down all by themselves. But maybe they can have a Department of Education with nobody who comes to work, and that would be the same as taking it down. And that's really sad that we're sort of using these corporate, aggressive, takeover tactics that really aren't appropriate for public institutions that are governed by law.
I look at it like building, and thank you again for breaking that down. I mean, guys, listen, here we have an expert on education and law, but we also have someone that has the ability to break down a complicated topic so that we understand the importance of education. Here is a person who is an educator or educated that can break down the importance of education in America. How wonderful it is that we have the Derek Blacks of the world that can do that, because what he just said is they're taking a business structural idea and trying to lay it over onto our government's operational system, and it doesn't work. They're truly oil and water, because there's laws that create the ability for the government to function. Businesses don't have laws that create that are designed to create their functionality. So you can't really merge the two when it comes to things that were enacted by Congress, and that's what a lot of people don't get when they think that, he can just write an executive order and this is done.
Well, and the thing that, worries and frustrates me, I was chatting with someone the other day, and they're kind of a little bit like, well, government waste, and we need a little bit of this and that. And I said, well, I didn't say to the person at that moment, it was a friend, but I said, look, if Twitter goes out of business, like that's fine. Some people are going to lose their jobs. They'll move on somewhere else. That was part of the deal. Like, we understand that businesses come and go, so they can take risks. But when we're talking about our children's lunch, right, low-income children's lunch, when we're talking about special services for students with disability, when we're talking about teachers showing up, and being there for our kids, 5 days a week, like, those are not things that we can take risks with breaking, because, right, it's not okay if the school doesn't show up. It's not okay if there's not lunch, right? And so I think that's the thing that some people miss, that, government waste. Well, you know what? Probably it does, but that's a function that we have to tolerate for the guarantee that government will be here when the you-know-what hits the fan. That's when COVID hits, right, and we don't have tax dollars to keep our schools going, and the federal government has to step in, right, to help our schools transition. With all the problems we had in COVID and all the learning loss, like, we moved forward with education. We tried as best we could. And so I think that's the thing, is that government is just fundamentally different and has to be fundamentally different, because we cannot afford for government to fail.
Not at all. And on any level, that's got to be the case. You have this wonderful book with the great title. It's called Dangerous Learning: The South's Long War on Black Literacy. Talk a little bit about your book. Talk a little bit about the importance of it when it comes to education.
Yeah, I started this book as a passion project. It grew out of another book, A Schoolhouse Burning. It was about the long history of the right to education. But what I found and sort of wrote about is how access to literacy has been the dividing line for freedom for Black people since 1820, right? That under the worst of conditions, right? There were schools that were open and Black people were learning on their own, but then they were shut down, and it really became that line between freedom and slavery, and it changed people's lives mentally. Some of them got to actual freedom through it. But then that same freedom line moves after the Civil War, right, which is how do we become citizens? And so, again, the public education system becomes freedom's line. And then, fast forward to Brown versus Board of Education, because we certainly didn't fix everything with the Civil War. And again, public education is the starting point for creating citizenship and equality for Black people. Well, the other side of that story is that there has been a push against that freedom every time, right? That we had the criminalization of Black literacy during slavery. We had Jim Crow almost immediately after we established public education in the South. And then, we talked a little about Reagan and Nixon. We had the backlash to Brown versus Board of Education that flatlined educational equality for a good 4 or 5 decades. Now, in 2020, we began to revisit our past failures, right, after the death of George Floyd and others, and say maybe we need to think a little bit harder about how we teach history, how we include people in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. And it was only about 12 to 18 months after that we saw another assault on public education. So, it's a long history of this sort of push and pull over, the right to education, the right to literacy for Black people, but also its importance to overall democracy. And so it's not just an issue for Black and brown children. It's an issue for white children, too, in those, rural disadvantaged places that I was referencing earlier.
Absolutely. And Derek, I'm so glad you put that last piece on in terms of rural white kids, little white boys and white girls are going to suffer the same fate. And that's what, going back to the piece about what's happening in Iowa, is so critically important, because Iowa's population is not predominantly Black or Hispanic or Muslim or Canadian or, whatever else. It's predominantly white. So this is where this institutional teardown is not, it starts in a particular group, but it's reaching other people. And it leads me to kind of sort of the last question, but it's my big why. Why do you think, why do you feel this is happening? And just if you can expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, and on this, we've seen this movement to tear down education flounder in certain respects over the last couple of decades. But what happened is that multiple constituents have come together at the same time. You first had religious groups who, for good or bad, wanted a piece of the public pie so that they could support religious education rather than public. So that never got anywhere. They tried to co-opt the Black community into going along with that, but they remembered that vouchers came out of school resistance to school integration, and so didn't get very far. But then you had this other group that are just sort of like anti-government, right? You had the Koch brothers, for instance. If you're anti-government at the federal level, you're anti-Social Security, anti-Medicare, Medicaid. If you're anti-government at the local level, you're anti-public education. That's where the lion's share of resources go. So some of this is just anti-tax, right? Anti-government, get folks off the dollar. And then during COVID, right, there was some more anti-government that spread more widely over frustration, which, over closures and the economy and all of that. But then the culture war, and that's what really put us over the top. When President Trump lost his last election, right, and we saw an attack on the Capitol, in the months that followed that, sort of vouchers became a litmus test on, are you with us or against us? Are you pro-government or anti-government? And it just became this new phenomenon where you had religion, anti-tax, and the culture war coming together, and it supercharged a movement that really hadn't gotten much purchase before then. And then you have, I guess, the final group that are just sycophants, that don't really have a policy or agenda other than to be in the in crowd of power, and they're just following this path.
Wow. That's profound, man. I thank you so much for breaking it down. And this is where history and education helps us out, folks. When you have someone like Derek Black that can break these complicated things down and give a historical perspective as to how we got here. I'm always intrigued when we can do that, Derek, because it does help us go, damn, I didn't realize that, and then be able to try to do something with it. So thank you for being with us in this short amount of time. We definitely would love to invite you back and talk more about this from a historical perspective, because I think a lot of times when people have that, they can then go, okay, I better understand how we got to where we are today. So appreciate you being with us this morning. We will definitely have you back on the show when you've got some time, and we can talk more about this in even greater depth. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great. Look forward to it.